Welcome back to House of Mirth by Edith Wharton. Today I'll be reading chapters 2 and 3. Last time we read chapter 1, introduced to Lily Bart, the main person in the story. She's lovely and sophisticated, funny. She runs in all the right circles, but she doesn't have any money. She's age 29, and that's getting up there in her time, 1905, and in her circles. She's not married. So she is in search of a husband, not because she really wants to get married from what we gather, but because she's going to need funds. She runs into Seldon Lawrence, who she really likes, and he is infatuated with her. They're at the train station. He invites her to his flat for a cup of tea. She hesitates but goes because it's very refreshing to get out of the heat. They have a cup of tea together, and he, in a light-hearted way, professes his love to her, and she says, "Oh, nonsense. I'm sorry, but you don't have enough money for me, but we could be lovely friends. Please come and visit me." He leaves it at that. When she leaves the flat, they note that there's a charwoman who sees her and sort of stares at her. The implication is that what was she doing, a lady, in a gentleman's apartment? As she continues to go, apparently very cautious to make sure nobody will see her, it says 1,000 to 1 that she'll be recognized. But as she walks forward, a man named Mr. Rosedale notices her and stops her. He seems to know who she is and says, My, where were you?" And she's flustered. She says, "I was at my dressmaker's." And he says, "That's the building that I own. I don't know of any dressmakers." He offers to drive her to the train station. She will have none of it. She sees a hansom cab go by and she hails it. Now, I'd like to mention about that. It is a particular kind of cab invented in England in 1834 or something. It's a horse-drawn carriage, but it's enclosed, so you're safe from the rain. And on the back, in the high in the back, is the driver of the horse. So it's an interesting design. Well, let's read chapters 2 and 3 right now. Chapter 2. In the hansom, she leaned back with a sigh. Why must a girl pay so dearly for her least escape from routine? Why could one never do a natural thing without having to screen it behind a structure of artifice? She had yielded to a passing impulse in going to Lawrence Seldon's rooms, and it was so seldom that she could allow herself the luxury of an impulse. This one, at any rate, was going to cost her rather more than she could afford. She was vexed to see that in spite of so many years of vigilance, she had blundered twice within 5 minutes. That stupid story about her dressmaker was bad enough. It could have been so simple to tell Rosedale that she had been taking tea with Seldon. The mere statement of fact would have rendered it innocuous. But after having let herself be surprised by a falsehood, she was doubly stupid to snub the witness with her discomfiture. If she had had the presence of mind to let Rosedale drive her to the station, the concession might have purchased his silence. He had his race's accuracy in the appraisal of values, and to be seen walking down the platform at a crowded afternoon hour in the company of Miss Lily Bart would have been money in his pocket, as he himself might have phrased it. He knew, of course, that there would be a large house party at Bellomont, and the possibility of being taken for one of Mrs. Trenors' guests was doubtlessly included in his calculations. Mr. Rosedale was still at a stage in his social ascent when it was of importance to produce such impressions. The provoking part was that Lily knew all this, knew how easy it would have been to silence him on the spot, and how difficult it might be to do so afterwards. Mr. Simon Rosedale was a man who made his business to know everything about everyone, whose idea of showing himself to be at home in society was to display an inconvenient familiarity with the habits of those with whom he wished to be thought intimate. Lily was sure that within 24 hours the story of her visiting her dressmaker at the Benedict would be in active circulation among Mr. Rosedale's acquaintances. The worst of it was that she had always snubbed and ignored him. On his first appearance, when her provident cousin Jack Stepney had obtained for him, in return for favors too easily guessed, a card to one of the vast impersonal Van Osburgh crushes, Rosedale, with a mixture of artistic sensibility and business astuteness which characterized him, had instantly gravitated toward Miss Bart. She understood his motives, for her own course was guided by as nice calculations. Training and experience had taught her to be hospitable to newcomers, since the most unpromising might be useful to her later on. And there were plenty of available oubliettes to swallow them if they were not. But some intuitive repugnance, getting the better of years of social discipline, had made her push Mr. Rosedale into his oubliette without trial. He had left behind only the ripple of amusement which his speedy dispatch had caused among her friends, and though, later, to shift the metaphor, he reappeared lower down the stream, it was only in fleeting glimpses with long submergences between. Hitherto, Lily had been undisturbed by scruples. In her little set, Mr. Rosedale had been pronounced impossible, and Jack Stepney roundly snubbed for his attempt to pay his debts at dinner invitations. Even Mrs. Trenor, whose taste for variety had led her into some hazardous experiments, resisted Jack's attempt to disguise Mr. Rosedale as a novelty, and declared that he was the same little Jew who had been served up and rejected at the social board a dozen times within her memory. And while Judy Trenor was obdurate, there was a small chance of Mr. Rosedale's penetrating beyond the outer limbo of the Van Osburgh crushes. Jack gave up the consent with a laughing, "You'll see," and sticking manfully to his guns, showed himself with Mr. Rosedale at the fashionable restaurants in company with the personally vivid, if socially obscure, ladies who are available for such purposes. But the attempt had hitherto been vain, and as Rosedale undoubtedly paid for the dinners, the laugh remained with his debtor. Mr. Rosedale, it will be seen, was thus far not a factor to be feared, unless one put oneself in his power. And this was precisely what Miss Bart had done. Her clumsy fib had let him see that she had something to conceal, and she was sure that he had a score to settle with her. Something in his smile told her he had not forgotten. She turned from this thought with a little shiver, but it hung on her all the way to the station and dogged her down the platform with the persistency of Mr. Rosedale himself. She had just time to take her seat before the train started, but having arranged herself in her corner with the instinctive feeling for effect which never forsook her, she glanced about in the hope of seeing some other member of the Trenors' party. She wanted to get away from herself, and conversation was the only means of escape that she knew. Her search was rewarded by the discovery of a very blond young man with a sort of soft reddish beard, who, at the other end of the carriage, appeared to be dissembling himself behind an unfolded newspaper. Lily's eye brightened, and a faint smile relaxed the drawn lines of her mouth. She had known that Mr. Percy Gryce was to be at the Bellomont, but she had not counted on the luck of having him to herself in the train, and the fact banished all perturbing thoughts of Mr. Rosedale. Perhaps, after all, the day was to end more favorably than it had begun. She began to cut the pages of a novel, tranquilly studying her prey through downcast lashes, while she organized a method of attack. Something in his attitude of conscious absorption told her that he was aware of her presence. No one had ever been quite so engrossed in an evening paper. She guessed that he was too shy to come to her, and that she would have to devise some means of approach which should not appear to be an advance on her part. It amused her to think that anyone as rich as Mr. Percy Gryce should be so shy, but she was gifted with treasures of indulgence and for such idiosyncrasies, and besides, his timidity might serve her purpose better than too much assurance. She had the art of giving self-confidence to the embarrassed, but she was not equally sure of being able to embarrass the self-confident. She waited until the train had emerged from the tunnel and was racing between the ragged edges of the northern suburbs. Then, as it lowered its speed near Yonkers, she rose from her seat and drifted slowly down the carriage. As she passed Mr. Gryce, the train gave a lurch, and he was aware of a slender hand gripping the back of his chair. He rose with a start. His ingenuous face looked as though it had been dipped in crimson. Even the reddish tint in his beard seemed to deepen. "Oh, Mr. Gryce, is that you? I'm so sorry. I was trying to find the porter and get some tea." She held out her hand as the train resumed its level rush, and they stood exchanging a few words in the aisle. Yes, he was going to Bellomont. He had heard that she would be at the party. He blushed again as he admitted it. And was he to be there for the whole week? How delightful. But at this point, one or two belated passengers from the last station forced their way into the carriage, and Lily had to retreat to her seat. The chair next to mine is empty. Do take it," she said over her shoulder. And Mr. Gryce, with considerable embarrassment, succeeded in effecting an exchange which enabled him to transport himself and his bags to her side. "Ah, and here is the porter, and perhaps we can have some tea." She signaled to the official, and in a moment, with the ease that seemed to attend the fulfillment of all her wishes, a little table had been set up between the seats, and she had helped Mr. Gryce to bestow his encumbering properties beneath it. When the tea came, he watched her in silent fascination while her hands flitted above the tray, looking miraculously fine and slender in contrast to the coarse china and lumpy bread. It seemed wonderful to him that anyone should perform with such careless ease the difficult task of making tea in public in a lurching train. He would never have dared to order it for himself, lest he should attract the notice of his fellow passengers. But secure in the shelter of her conspicuousness, he sipped the inky draught with a delicious sense of exhilaration. Lily, with the flavor of Seldon's caravan tea on her lips, had no great fancy to drown it in the railway brew, which seemed such nectar to her companion. But, rightly judging that one of the charms of tea is the fact of drinking it together, she proceeded to give the last touch to Mr. Gryce's enjoyment by smiling at him across her lifted cup. "Is it quite right? I haven't made it too strong?" she asked solicitously, and he replied with conviction that he had never tasted better tea. "I dare say it is true," she reflected, and her imagination was fired by the thought that Mr. Gryce, who might have sounded the depths of the most complex self-indulgence, was perhaps actually taking his first journey alone with a pretty woman. It struck her as providential that she should be the instrument of his initiation. Some girls would not have known how to manage him. They would have overemphasized the novelty of the adventure, trying to make him feel in it the zest of an escapade, but Lily's methods were more delicate. She remembered that her cousin Jack Stepney had once defined Mr. Gryce as the young man who had promised his mother never to go out in the rain without his overshoes, and, acting on this hint, she resolved to impart a gently domestic air to the scene, in the hope that her companion, instead of feeling that he was doing something reckless or unusual, would merely be led to dwell on the adventure of always having a companion to make one's tea on the train. But in spite of her efforts, conversation flagged after the tray had been removed, and she was driven to take a fresh measurement of Mr. Gryce's limitations. It was not, after all, opportunity, but imagination that he lacked. He had a mental palate which would never learn to distinguish between railway tea and nectar. There was, however, one topic she could rely on, one spring that she had only to touch to set his simple machinery in motion. She had refrained from touching it because it was the last resource, and she had relied on other arts to stimulate other sensations. But as a settled look of dullness began to creep over his candid features, she saw that extreme measures were necessary. "And how," she said, leaning forward, "are you getting on with your Americana?" His eye became a degree less opaque, and it was as though an incipient film had been removed from it, and she felt the pride of a skillful operator. "I've got a few new things," he said, suffused with pleasure, but lowering his voice as though he feared his fellow passengers might be in league to despoil him. She returned a sympathetic inquiry, and gradually he was drawn on to talk of his latest purchases. It was the one subject which enabled him to forget himself, or allowed him rather to remember himself without constraint, because he was at home in it, and could assert a superiority that there were few to dispute. Hardly any of his acquaintances cared for Americana, or knew anything about them, and the consciousness of this ignorance threw Mr. Gryce's knowledge into agreeable relief. The only difficulty was to introduce the topic and to keep it to the front. Most people showed no desire to have their ignorance dispelled, and Mr. Gryce was like a merchant whose warehouses are crammed with an unmarketable commodity. But Miss Bart, it appeared, really did want to know about Americana, and moreover, she was already sufficiently informed to make the task of further instruction as easy as it was agreeable. She questioned him intelligently. She heard him submissively, and, prepared for the look of lassitude which usually crept over his listeners' faces, he grew eloquent under her receptive gaze. The points she had had the presence to mind of mind to glean from Seldon, in anticipation of this very contingency, were serving her to such good purpose that she began to think of her visit to him had been the luckiest incident of the day. She had once more shown her talent for profiting by the unexpected, and dangerous theories as to the advisability of yielding to impulse were germinating under the surface of smiling attention which she continued to present to her companion. Mr. Gryce's sensations, if less definite, were equally agreeable. He felt his continued titillation, with which the lower organisms welcomed the gratification of their needs, and all his senses floundered in a vague well-being through which Miss Bart's personality was dimly but pleasantly perceptible. Mr. Gryce's interest in Americana had not originated with himself. It was impossible to think of him as evolving any taste of his own. An uncle had left him a collection already noted among bibliophiles. The existence of the collection was the only fact that had ever shed glory on the name of Gryce, and the nephew took as much pride in his inheritance as though it had been his own work. Indeed, he gradually came to regard it as such, and to feel a sense of personal complacency when he chanced on any reference to the Gryce Americana. Anxious as he was to avoid personal notice, he took in the printed message mention of his name a pleasure so exquisite and excessive that it seemed a compensation for his shrinking from publicity. To enjoy the sensation as often as possible, he subscribed to all the reviews dealing with the book collecting in general, and American history in particular, and as allusions to his library abounded in the pages of those journals, which formed his only reading, he came to regard himself as figuring prominently in the public eye, and to enjoy the thought of the interest which would be excited if the persons he met on the street or sat among in traveling were suddenly to be told that he was the possessor of the Gryce Americana. Most timidities have such secret compensations, and Miss Bart was discerning enough to know that the inner vanity is generally in proportion to the outer self-deprecation. With a more confident person, she would not have dared to dwell so long on one topic, or to show such exaggerated interest in it, but she had rightly guessed that Mr. Gryce's egoism was a thirsty soil, requiring constant nurture from without. Miss Bart had the gift of following an undercurrent of thought while she appeared to be sailing on the surface of conversation. And in this case, her mental excursion took the form of a rapid survey of Mr. Percy Gryce's future as combined with her own. The Gryces were from Albany, but lately introduced to the metropolis, where the mother and son had come after old Jefferson Gryce's death to take possession of his house in Madison Avenue, an appalling house, all brownstone without and black walnut within, with the Gryce library in a fireproof annex that looked like a mausoleum. Lily, however, knew all about them. Young Mr. Gryce, as Young Mr. Gryce's arrival had fluttered the maternal breasts of New York, and when a girl has no mother to palpitate for her, she must needs be on the alert for herself. Lily, therefore, had not only contrived to put herself in the young man's way, but had made the acquaintance of Mrs. Gryce, a monumental woman with the voice of a pulpit orator and a mind preoccupied with the iniquities of her servants, who came sometimes to sit with Mrs. Peniston and learn from that lady how she managed to prevent the kitchen maid smuggling groceries out of the house. Mrs. Gryce had a kind of impersonal benevolence. Case of individual need she regarded with suspicion, but she subscribed to the institutions with their annual reports, uh, when their annual reports showed an impressive surplus. Her domestic duties were manifold, for they extended from furtive inspections of the servants' bedrooms to unannounced descents into the cellar. But she had never allowed herself many pleasures. Once, however, she had had a special edition of the Sarum Rule printed in rubric and presented to every clergyman in the diocese, and the gilt album in which their letters of thanks were pasted formed the chief ornament of her drawing room table. Percy had been brought up in the principles which so excellent a woman was sure to inculcate. Every form of prudence and suspicion had been grafted on a nature originally reluctant and cautious, with the result that it would have seemed hardly needful for Mrs. Gryce to extract his promise about the overshoes, so little likely was he to hazard himself abroad in the rain. After attaining his majority and coming into the fortune which the late Mr. Gryce had made out of a patent device for excluding fresh air from hotels, the young man continued to live with his mother in Albany. But on Jefferson Gryce's death, when another large property passed into her son's hands, Mrs. Gryce thought that what she called his interests demanded his presence in New York. She accordingly installed herself in the Madison Avenue house, and Percy, whose sense of duty was not inferior to his mother's, spent all his weekdays in the handsome Broad Street office, where a batch of pale men on small salaries had grown gray in the management of the Gryce estate, and where he was initiated with becoming reverence into every detail of the art of accumulation. As far as Lily could learn, this had hitherto been Mr. Gryce's only occupation, and she might have been pardoned for thinking it not too hard a task to interest a young man who had been kept on such a low diet. At any rate, she felt herself so completely in command of the situation that she yielded to a sense of security in which all fear of Mr. Rosedale and of those difficulties on which that fear was contingent vanished beyond the edge of thought. The stopping of the train at Garrison's would not have distracted her from those thoughts, had she not caught a sudden look of distress in her companion's eye. His seat faced toward the door, and she guessed that he had been perturbed by the approach of an acquaintance, a fact confirmed by the turning of heads and general sense of commotion which her own entrance into the railway carriage was apt to produce. She knew the symptoms at once, and was not surprised to be hailed by the high notes of a pretty woman who entered the train accompanied by a maid, a bull terrier, and a footman staggering under a load of bags and dressing cases. "Oh, Lily! Are you going to the Bellomont? Then you can't let me have your seat, I suppose. But I must have a seat in this carriage. Porter, you must find me a place at once. Can't someone be put somewhere else? I want to be with my friends. Oh, how do you do, Mr. Gryce? Do please make him understand that I must have a seat next to you and Lily." Mrs. George Dorset, regardless of the mild efforts of a traveler with a carpet bag, who was doing his best to make room for her by getting out of the train, stood in the middle of the aisle, diffusing about her that general sense of exasperation which a pretty woman on her travels not infrequently creates. She was smaller and thinner than Lily Bart, with a restless pliability of pose, as if she could have been crumpled up and run through a ring like the sinuous draperies she affected. Her small, pale face seemed the mere setting of a pair of large, exaggerated eyes, of which the visionary gaze contrasted curiously with her self-assertive tone and gestures, so that, as one of her friends observed, she was like a disembodied spirit who took up a great deal of room. Having finally discovered that the seat adjoining Miss Bart's was at her disposal, she possessed herself of it with a further displacement of her surroundings, explaining meanwhile that she had come across from Mount Kisco in her motor car that morning, and had been kicking her heels for an hour at Garrison's without even the alleviation of a cigarette, her brute of a husband having neglected to replenish her case before they parted that morning. "And at this hour of the day, I don't suppose you've a single one left, have you, Lily?" she plaintively concluded. Miss Bart caught the startled glance of Mr. Percy Gryce, whose own lips were never defiled by tobacco. "What an absurd question, Bertha!" she exclaimed, blushing at the thought of the store she had laid in at Lawrence Seldon's. "Why don't you smoke? Since when have you given it up? What? You never, and you don't either, Mr. Gryce? Ah, of course. How stupid of me. I understand." And Mrs. Dorset leaned back against her traveling cushions with a smile which made Lily wish there had been no vacant seat beside her own. Chapter 3. Bridge at Bellomont usually lasted until the small hours, and when Lily went to bed that night she had played too long for her own good. Feeling no desire for the self-communion which awaited her in the room, she lingered on the broad stairway looking down into the hall below, where the cast of card-players were grouped about the tray of tall glasses and silver-collared decanters, which the butler had just placed on the low table near the fire. The hall was arcaded with a gallery, supported on columns of pale yellow marble. Tall clumps of flowering plants were grouped against a background of dark foliage in the angles of the walls. On the crimson carpet a deerhound and 2 or 3 spaniels dozed luxuriously before the fire, and the light from the great central lantern overhead shed a brightness on the woman's hair and struck sparks from their jewels as they moved. There were moments when such scenes delighted Lily, when they gratified her sense of beauty and her craving for the external finish of life. There were others when they gave a sharper edge to the meagerness of her own opportunities. This was one of those moments when the sense of contrast was uppermost, and she turned away impatiently as Mrs. George Dorset, glittering in the serpentine spangles, drew Percy Gryce into her wake to a confidential nook beneath the gallery. It was not that Miss Bart was afraid of losing her newly acquired hold over Mr. Gryce. Mrs. Dorset might startle or bedazzle him, but she had neither the skill nor the patience to effect his capture. She was too self-engrossed to penetrate the recesses of his shyness, and besides, why should she care to give herself the trouble? At most it might amuse her to make sport of his simplicity for an evening. After that he would be merely a burden to her, and knowing this, she was far too experienced to encourage him. But the mere thought of that other woman, who could take a man up and toss him aside if she willed, without having to regard him as a possible factor in her plans, filled Lily Bart with envy. She had been bored all afternoon by Percy Gryce. The mere thought seemed to waken an echo of his droning voice. But she could not ignore him on the morrow. She must follow up her successes, must submit to more boredom, must be ready with fresh compliances and adaptabilities, and all on the bare chance that he might ultimately decide to do her the honor of boring her for life. It was a hateful fate, but how to escape from it? What choice had she? To be herself or Gertie Farish? As she entered her bedroom with its softly shaded lights, her lace dressing gown lying across the silken bedspread, her little embroidered slippers before the fire, a vase of carnations filling the air with perfume, and the last novels and magazines lying uncut on a table beside the reading lamp, she had a vision of Miss Farish's cramped flat, with its cheap conveniences and hideous wallpapers. No, she was not made for mean and shabby surroundings, for these squalid compromises of poverty. Her whole being dilated in an atmosphere of luxury. It was the background she required, and the only climate she could breathe in. But the luxury of others was not what she wanted. A few years ago it had sufficed her. She had taken her daily meed of pleasures without caring who provided it. Now she was beginning to chafe at the obligations it imposed, and to feel herself a mere pensioner on the splendor which had once seemed to belong to her. There were even moments when she was conscious of having to pay her way. For a long time she had refused to play bridge. She knew that she could not afford it, and she was afraid of acquiring so expensive a taste. She had seen the danger exemplified in more than one of her associates, in young Ned Silverton, for instance, the charming fair boy, now seated in abject rapture at the elbow of Mrs. Fisher, a striking divorcee with eyes and gowns as emphatic as the headlines of her case. Lily could remember when young Silverton had stumbled into their circle with the air of a strayed Arcadian who has published charming sonnets in his college journal. Since then, he had developed a taste for Fisher and bridge, and the latter at least had involved him in expenses from which he had been more than once rescued by harassed maiden sisters who treasured the sonnets and went without sugar in their tea to keep their darling afloat. Ned's case was familiar to Lily. She had seen his charming eyes, which had a good deal more poetry in them than the sonnets, change from surprise to amusement, and from amusement to anxiety as he passed under the spell of the terrible god of chance. And she was afraid of discovering the same symptoms in her own case. For in the last year she had found that her hostesses expected her to take a place at the card table. It was one of the taxes she had to pay for their prolonged hospitality, for the dresses and trinkets which occasionally replenished her insufficient wardrobe. And since she had played regularly, the passion had grown on her. Once or twice of late she had won a large sum, and instead of keeping it against future losses, had spent it in dress or jewelry. And the desire to atone for this imprudence, combined with the increasing exhilaration of the game, drove her to risk higher stakes at each fresh venture. She tried to excuse herself on the plea that in the Trenors set, if one played at all, one must play high or be set down as priggish or stingy. But she knew that the gambling passion was upon her, and that in her present surroundings there was small hope of resisting it. Tonight the luck had been persistently bad, and the little gold purse which hung amongst her trinkets was almost empty when she returned to her room. She unlocked the wardrobe, and taking out her jewel case, looked under the tray for the roll of bills from which she had replenished the purse before going down to dinner. Only $20 were left. The discovery was so startling that for a moment she fancied she must have been robbed. Then she took paper and pencil, and seating herself at the writing table, tried to reckon up what she had spent during the day. Her head was throbbing with fatigue. She had to go over the figures again and again, but at last it became clear to her that she had lost $300 at cards. She took out her checkbook to see if her balance was larger than she remembered, but found she had erred in the other direction. Then she returned to her calculations, but figure as she would, she could not conjure back the vanished $300. It was the sum she had set aside to pacify her dressmaker, unless she should decide to use it up as a sop to the jeweler. At any rate, she had so many uses for it that its very insufficiency had caused her to play high in the hope of doubling it. But of course she had lost. She, who needed every penny, while Bertha Dorset, whose husband showered money on her, must have pocketed at least 500, and Judy Trenor, who could have afforded to lose 1,000 a night, had left the table clutching such heaps of bills that she had been unable to shake hands with her guests when they bade her good night. A world in which such things could be seemed a miserable place to Lily Bart. But then she had never been able to understand the laws of a universe which was so ready to leave her out of its calculations. She began to undress without ringing for her maid, whom she had sent to bed. She had been long enough in bondage to other people's pleasure to be considerate of those who depended on hers, and in her bitter moods it sometimes struck her that she and her maid were in the same position, except that the latter received her wages more regularly. As she sat before the mirror brushing her hair, her face looked hollow and pale, and she was frightened by two little lines near her mouth, faint flaws in the smooth curve of the cheek. "Oh, I must stop worrying," she exclaimed, "unless it's the electric light," she reflected, springing up from her seat and lighting the candles on the dressing table. She turned out the wall lights and peered at herself between the candle flames. The white oval of her face swam out waveringly from a background of shadows, the uncertain light blurring it like a haze, but the two lines on the mouth, about the mouth, remained. Lily rose and undressed in haste. "It is only because I am tired and have such odious things to think about," she kept repeating, and it seemed to add an added injustice that petty cares should leave a trace on the beauty which was her only defense against them. But the odious things were there, and remained with her. She returned wearily to the thought of Percy Gryce, as a wayfarer picks up a heavy load and toils on after a brief rest. She was almost sure that she had landed him. A few days' work, and she would win her reward. But the reward itself seemed unpalatable just then. She could get no zest from the thought of victory. It would be a rest from worry, no more. And how little that would have seemed to her a few years earlier. Her ambitions had shrunk gradually in the desiccating air of failure. But why had she failed? Was it her own fault, or that of destiny? She remembered how her mother, after they had lost their money, used to say to her, with a kind of fierce vindictiveness, "But you'll get it all back, you'll get it all back, with your face." The remembrance roused a whole train of association, and she lay in the darkness reconstructing the past out of which her present had grown. A house in which no one ever dined at home unless there was company, a doorbell perpetually ringing, a hall table showered with square envelopes which were opened in haste, and oblong envelopes which were allowed to gather dust in the depths of a bronze jar, a series of French and English maids giving warning amid a chaos of hurriedly ransacked wardrobes and dress closets, an equally changing dynasty of nurses and footmen, quarrels in the pantry, the kitchen, and the drawing-room, precipitate trips to Europe and returns from with gorged trunks, and days of interminable unpacking, semi-annual discussions as to where the summer should be spent, gray interludes of economy, and brilliant reactions of expense. Such was the setting of Lily Bart's first memories. Ruling the turbulent element called home, with the vigorous and determined figure of a mother still young enough to dance her ball dresses to rags, where the hazy outline of a neutral-tinted father filled an indeterminate space between the butler and the man who came to wind the clocks. Even to the eyes of infancy, Mrs. Hudson Bart had appeared young, but Lily could not recall the time when her father had not been bald and slightly stooping, with streaks of gray in his hair and a tired walk. It was a shock to her to learn afterward that he was but 2 years older than her mother. Lily seldom saw her father by daylight. All day he was downtown, and in winter it was long after nightfall when she heard his fagged step on the stairs and his hand on the schoolroom door. He would kiss her in the silence, and ask one or two questions of the nurse or the governess. Then Mrs. Bart's maid would come to remind him that he was dining out, and he would hurry away with a nod to Lily. In summer, when he joined them for a Sunday at Newport or Southampton, he was even more effaced and silent than in the winter. It seemed to tire him to rest, and he would sit for hours staring at the sea line from a quiet corner of the veranda, while the clatter of his wife's existence went on unheeded a few feet off. Generally, however, Mrs. Bart and Lily went to Europe for the summer, and before the steamer was halfway over, Mr. Bart dipped below the horizon. Sometimes his daughter heard him denounced for having neglected to forward Mrs. Bart's remittances, but for the most part he was never mentioned or thought of till his patient, stooping figure presented itself on the New York dock, as a buffer between the magnitude of his wife's luggage and the restrictions of the American custom house. In this desultory yet agitated fashion, life went on through Lily's teens, a zigzag, broken course down which the family craft glided on a rapid current of amusement, tugged at by the underflow of perpetual need, the need of more money. Lily could not recall a time when there had been money enough, and in some vague way her father seemed always to blame for the deficiency. It could certainly not be the fault of Mrs. Bart, who was spoken of by her friends as a wonderful manager. Mrs. Bart was famous for the unlimited effect she produced on limited means, and to the lady and her acquaintances there was something heroic in living as though one were much richer than one's bank book denoted. Lily was naturally proud of her mother's aptitude in this line. She had been brought up in the faith that, whatever the cost, one must have a good cook and be what Mrs. Bart called decently dressed. Mrs. Bart's worst reproach to her husband was to ask him if he expected her to live like a pig, and his replying in the negative was always regarded as a justification for cabling to Paris for an extra dress or two, and telephoning to the jeweler that he might after all send home the turquoise bracelet which Mrs. Bart had looked at in the morning. Lily knew people who lived like pigs, and their appearance and surroundings justified her mother's repugnance to that form of existence. They were mostly cousins who inhabited dingy houses with engravings from Cole's Voyage of Life on the drawing room walls, and slatternly parlour maids who said, "I'll go and see," to visitors calling at an hour when all right-minded persons are conventionally, if not actually, out. The disgusting part of it was that many of these cousins were rich, so that Lillian imbibed the idea that if people lived like pigs, it was from choice, and through the lack of any proper standard of conduct. This gave her a sense of reflected superiority, and she did not need Mrs. Bart's comments on the family frumps and misers to foster her naturally lively taste for splendor. Lily was 19 when circumstances caused her to revise her view of the universe. The previous year she had made a dazzling debut fringed by a heavy thundercloud of bills. The light of the debut still lingered on the horizon, but the cloud had thickened and suddenly it broke. The suddenness added to the horror, and there were still times when Lily relived with painful vividness every detail of the day on which the blow fell. She and her mother had been seated at the luncheon table over the chaud-froid and sold salmon from the previous night's dinner. It was one of Mrs. Bart's few economies to consume in private the expensive remnants of her hospitality. Lily was feeling the pleasant languor which is youth's penalty for dancing till dawn, but her mother, in spite of a few lines about her mouth, and under the yellow waves of her temples, was as alert, determined, and high in color as if she had risen from an untroubled sleep. In the center of the table, between the melting marron glacé and the candied cherries, a pyramid of American beauties lifted their vigorous stems and held their heads as high as Mrs. Bart. But their rose color had turned to a dissipated purple, and Lily's sense of fitness was disturbed by their reappearance on the luncheon table. "I really think, Mother," she said reproachfully, "that we might afford a few fresh flowers for luncheon. Just some jonquille or lily of the valley." Mrs. Bart stared. Her own fastidiousness had its eye fixed on the world, and she did not care how the luncheon table looked when there was no one present but the family. But she smiled at her daughter's innocence. "Lilies of the valley," she said calmly, "cost $2 a dozen at this season." Lily was not impressed. She knew very little of the value of money. "It would not take more than 6 dozen to fill that bowl," she argued. "6 dozen what?" asked her father's voice in the doorway. The two women looked up in surprise. Though it was a Saturday, the sight of Mr. Bart at luncheon was an unwanted one, but neither his wife nor his daughter was sufficiently interested to ask an explanation. Mr. Bart dropped into a chair and sat gazing absently at the fragment of jellied salmon which the butler had placed before him. "I was only saying," Lily began, "that I hate to see faded flowers at luncheon, and Mother says a bunch of lilies of the valley would not cost more than $12. Mayn't I tell the florist to send a few every day?" She leaned confidently toward her father. He seldom refused her anything, and Mrs. Bart had taught her to plead with him when her own entreaties failed. Mr. Bart sat motionless, his gaze still fixed on the salmon, and his lower jaw dropped. He looked even paler than usual. His thin hair lay in untidy streaks on his forehead. Suddenly he looked at his daughter and laughed. But the laugh was so strange that Lily colored under it. She disliked being ridiculed, and her father seemed to see something ridiculous in the request. Perhaps he thought it foolish that she should trouble him about such a trifle. $12. $12 a day for flowers. Oh, certainly, my dear. Give him an order for 1,200. He continued to laugh. Mrs. Bart gave him a quick glance. "You needn't wait, Polwarth. I'll ring for you," she said to the butler. The butler withdrew with an air of silent disapproval, leaving the remains of the chaud-froid on the sideboard. "What is the matter, Hudson? Are you ill?" said Mrs. Bart severely. She had no tolerance for scenes which were not of her own making, and it was odious to her that her husband should make a show of himself before the servants. "Are you ill?" she repeated. "Ill? No, I'm ruined," he said. Lily made a frightened sound, and Mrs. Bart rose to her feet. "Ruined?" she cried, but controlling herself instantly, she turned a calm face to Lily. "Shut the pantry door," she said. Lily obeyed, and when she turned back into the room, her father was sitting with both elbows on the table, the plate of salmon between them, and his head bowed on his hands. Mrs. Bart stood over him with a white face which made her hair unnaturally yellow. She looked at Lily as the latter approached. Her look was terrible, but her voice was modulated to a ghastly cheerfulness. "Your father is not well. He doesn't know what he's saying. It is nothing, but you better go upstairs and don't talk to the servants," she added. Lily obeyed. She always obeyed when her mother spoke in that voice. She had not been deceived by Bart's words. Mrs. Bart's words. She knew at once that they were ruined. In the dark hours which followed, that awful fact overshadowed even her father's slow and difficult dying. To his wife, he was no longer counted. He had become extinct. When he ceased to fulfill his purpose, and she sat at his side with the provisional air of a traveler who waits for a belated train to start. Lily's feelings were softer. She pitied him in a frightened, ineffectual way. But the fact that he was for the most part unconscious, and that his attention, when she stole into the room, drifted away from her after a moment, made him even more of a stranger than in the nursery days when he had never come home until after dark. She seemed always to have seen him through a blur, first of sleepiness, then of distance, then indifference, and now the fog had thickened till he was almost indistinguishable. If she could have performed any little services for him, or have exchanged with him a few of those affecting words which an extensive perusal of fiction have led her to connect with such occasions, the filial instinct might have stirred in her. But her pity, finding no active expression, remained in a state of spectatorship, overshadowed by her mom's grim, unflagging resentment. Every look and act of Mrs. Bart seemed to say, "You are sorry for him now, but you will feel differently when you see what he has done to us." It was a relief to Lily when her father died. Then a long winter set in. There was little money left, but to Mrs. Bart it seemed worse than nothing, a mere mockery of what she was entitled to. What was the use of living if one had to live like a pig? She sank into a kind of furious apathy, a state of inert anger against fate. Her faculty for managing deserted her, for she no longer took sufficient pride in it to exert it. It was well enough to manage when by doing so one could keep one's own carriage, but when one's best contrivance did not conceal the fact that one had to go on foot, the effort was no longer worth making. Lily and her mother wandered from place to place, now paying long visits to relations whose housekeeping Mrs. Bart criticized, and who deplored the fact that she let Lily breakfast in bed when the girl had no prospects before her, and now vegetating in cheap continental refuges where Mrs. Bart held herself fiercely aloof from the frugal tea tables of her companions in misfortune. She was especially careful to avoid her old friends and the scenes of her former successes. To be poor seemed to her such a confession of failure that it amounted to disgrace, and she detected a note of condensation in her friendliest advances. In the friendliest advances. Only one thought consoled her, and that was the contemplation of Lily's beauty. She studied it with a kind of passion, as though it were some weapon she had slowly fashioned for her vengeance. It was the last asset in their fortunes, the nucleus around which their life was to be rebuilt. She watched it jealously, as though it were her own property, and Lily its mere custodian, and she tried to instill into the latter a sense of responsibility that such a charge involved. She followed in imagination the career of other beauties, pointed out to her daughter what might be achieved through such a gift, and dwelling on the awful warning of those who, in spite of it, had failed to get what they wanted. To Mrs. Bart, only stupidity could explain the lamentable denouement of some of her examples. She was not above the inconsistency of charging fate rather than herself with her own misfortunes, but she inveighed so acrimoniously against love matches that Lily would have fancied her own marriage had been of that nature, had not Mrs. Bart frequently assured her that she had been talked into it by whom she never made clear. Lily was duly impressed by the magnitude of her opportunities. The dinginess of her present life threw into enchanting relief the existence to which she felt herself entitled. To a less illuminated intelligence, Mrs. Bart's counsels might have been dangerous, but Lily understood that beauty is only the raw material of conquest, and that to convert it into success other arts are required. She knew that to betray any sense of superiority was a subtler form of the stupidity her mother denounced, and it did not take her long to learn that a beauty needs more tact than the possessor of an average set of features. Her ambitions were not as crude as Mrs. Bart's. It had been among that lady's grievances that her husband, in the early days, before he was too tired, had wasted his evenings in what she vaguely described as reading poetry. And among the effects packed off to auction after his death were a score or two of dingy volumes which had struggled for existence among the boots and medicine bottles of his dressing-room shelves. There was in Lily a vein of sentiment, perhaps transmitted from this source, which gave an idealizing touch to her most prosaic purposes. She liked to think of her beauty as a power for good, as giving her the opportunity to attain a position where she should make her influence felt in the vague diffusion of refinement and good taste. She was fond of pictures and flowers and of sentimental fiction, and she could not help thinking that the possession of such tastes ennobled her desires for worldly advantages. She would not indeed have cared to marry a man who was merely rich. She was secretly ashamed of her mother's crude passion for money. Lily's preference would have been for an English nobleman with political ambitions and vast estates, or, for second choice, an Italian prince with a castle in the Apennines and an hereditary office in the Vatican. Lost causes had a romantic charm for her, and she liked to picture herself as standing aloof from the vulgar press of the Quirinal, and sacrificing her pleasure to the claims of an immemorial tradition. How long ago and how far off it all seemed. Those ambitions were hardly more futile and childish than the earlier ones which had centered about the possession of a French jointed doll with real hair. Was it only 10 years since she had wavered in imagination between the English earl and the Italian prince? Relentlessly her mind travelled on over the dreary interval. After 2 years of hungry roaming, Mrs. Bart had died of a deep disgust. She had hated dinginess, and it was her fate to be dingy. Her visions of a brilliant marriage for Lily had faded after the first year. People can't marry you if they don't see you, and how can they see you in these holes where we're stuck? That was the burden of her lament, and her last adjuration to her daughter was to escape from dinginess if she could. Don't let it creep up on you and drag you down. Fight your way out of it somehow. You're young and can do it, she insisted. She had died during one of their brief visits to New York, and there Lily at once became the center of a family council composed of the wealthy relatives whom she had been taught to despise for living like pigs. It may be that they had an inkling of the sentiments in which she had been brought up, for none of them manifested a very lively desire for her company. Indeed, the question threatened to remain unsolved till Mrs. Peniston, with a sigh, announced, "I'll try her for a year." Everyone was surprised, but one and all concealed their surprise lest Mrs. Peniston should be alarmed by it into reconsidering her decision. Mrs. Peniston was Mr. Bart's widowed sister, and if she was by no means the richest of the family group, its other members nevertheless abounded in reasons why she was clearly designed by Providence to assume the charge of Lily. In the first place, she was alone, and it would be charming for her to have a young companion. Then she sometimes travelled, and Lily's familiarity with foreign customs, deplored as a misfortune by her more conservative relatives, would at least enable her to act as a kind of courier. But as a matter of fact, Mrs. Peniston had not been affected by these considerations. She had taken the girl simply because no one else would have her, and because she had the kind of moral mauvaise honte which makes the public display of selfishness difficult, though it does not interfere with its private indulgence. It would have been impossible for Mrs. Peniston to be heroic on a desert island, but with the eyes of her little world upon her, she took a certain pleasure in her act. She reaped the reward to which disinterestedness is entitled, and found an agreeable companion for her niece. She had expected to find Lily headstrong, critical, and foreign, for even Mrs. Peniston, though she occasionally went abroad, had the family dread of foreignness. But the girl showed a pliancy which, to a more penetrating mind than her aunt's, might have been less reassuring than the open selfishness of youth. Misfortune had made Lily supple instead of hardening her, and a pliable substance is less easy to break than a stiff one. Mrs. Peniston, however, did not suffer from her niece's adaptability. Lily had no intention of taking advantage of her aunt's good nature. She was, in truth, grateful for the refuge offered her. Mrs. Peniston's opulent interior was at least not externally dingy. But dinginess is a quality which assumes all manners of disguises, and Lily soon found that it was as latent in the expensive routine of her aunt's life as in the makeshift existence of a continental pension. Mrs. Peniston was one of the episodical persons who form the padding of life. It was impossible to believe that she herself had ever been the focus of activities. The most vivid thing about her was the fact that her grandmother had been a Van Alstyne. This connection with the well-fed and industrious stock of early New York revealed itself in the glacial neatness of Mrs. Peniston's drawing room and in the excellence of her cuisine. She belonged to the class of old New Yorkers who have always lived well, dressed expensively, and done little else. And to these inherited obligations Mrs. Peniston faithfully conformed. She had always been a looker-on at life, and her mind resembled one of those little mirrors which her Dutch ancestors were accustomed to affix to their upper windows, so that from the depths of an impenetrable domesticity they might see what was happening in the street. Mrs. Peniston was the owner of a country place in New Jersey, but she had never lived there since her husband's death, a remote event, which appeared to dwell in her memory chiefly as a dividing point to the personal reminiscences that formed the staple of her conversation. She was a woman who remembered dates with intensity and could tell at a moment's notice whether the drawing room curtains had been renewed before or after Mr. Peniston's last illness. Mrs. Peniston thought the country lonely and the trees damp, and cherished a vague fear of meeting a bull. To guard against such contingencies, she frequented the more populous watering places, where she installed herself impersonally in a hired house, and looked on at life through the matting screen of her veranda. In the care of such a guardian, it soon became clear to Lily that she was to enjoy only the material advantages of good food and expensive clothing, and, though far from underrating these, she would gladly have exchanged them for what Mrs. Bart had taught her to regard as opportunities. She sighed to think what her mother's fierce energies would have accomplished had they been coupled with Mrs. Peniston's resources. Lily had an abundant energy of her own, but it was restricted by the necessity of adapting herself to her aunt's habits. She saw that at all costs she must keep Mrs. Peniston's favor till, as Mrs. Bart would have phrased it, she could stand on her own legs. Lily had no mind for the vagabond life and the poor relation, and to adapt herself to Mrs. Peniston, she had, to some degree, to assume that lady's passive attitude. She had fancied at first that it would be easy to draw her aunt into the whirl of her own activities. But there was a static force in Mrs. Peniston against which her niece's efforts spent themselves in vain. To attempt to bring her into active relation with life was like tugging at a piece of furniture which has been screwed to the floor. She did not indeed expect Lily to remain equally immovable. She had all the American guardian's indulgence for the volatility of youth. She had indulgence for certain other habits of her nieces. It seemed to her natural that Lily should spend all her money on dresses, and she supplemented the girl's scanty income by occasional handsome presents, meant to be applied to the same purpose. Lily, who was intensely practical, would have preferred a fixed allowance, but Mrs. Peniston liked the periodical recurrence of gratitude evoked by unexpected checks, and was perhaps shrewd enough to perceive that such a method of giving kept alive in her niece a salutary sense of dependence. Beyond this, Mrs. Peniston had not felt called upon to do anything for her charge. She had simply stood aside and let her take the field. Lily had taken it, at first with the confidence of assured possessorship, then with gradually narrowing demands, until now she found herself actually struggling for a foothold on the broad space which had once seemed her own for the asking. How it happened, she did not yet know. Sometimes she thought it was because Mrs. Peniston had been too passive, and again, she feared it was because she herself had not been passive enough. Had she shown an undue eagerness for victory? Had she lacked patience, pliancy, and dissimulation? Whether she charged herself with these faults or absolved herself from them made no difference in the sum total of her failure. Younger and plainer girls had been married off by dozens, and she was 29, and still Miss Bart. She was beginning to have fits of angry rebellion against fate, when she longed to drop out of the race and make an independent life for herself. But what matter of life would it be? She had barely enough money to pay her dressmaker's bills and her gambling debts, and none of the desultory interests which she dignified with the name of tastes was pronounced enough to enable her to live contentedly in obscurity. Ah, no, she was too intelligent not to be honest with herself. She knew that she hated dinginess as much as her mother had hated it, and to her last breath she meant to fight against it, dragging herself up again and again above the flood, till she gained the bright pinnacles of success which presented such a slippery surface to her clutch. End of chapter 3.